France, September 1944. A makeshift Allied headquarters in a commandeered French chateau, the kind of place that had stood for 300 years and now bore the scars of liberation bullet holes in the limestone walls, broken windows hastily covered with canvas, the smell of plaster dust mixing with cigarette smoke and the leather of military boots. In a grand room that once hosted aristocratic parties, now filled with maps and radio equipment, stands a captured Luftwaffe Hauptmann, a captain, shot down 2 days earlier when his FW-190 took a burst of .50 caliber fire from an American P-47 Thunderbolt, and he barely made it to the ground alive. His flight suit is scorched, he's got a bandage wrapped around his head, and he's standing ramrod straight despite the pain, still carrying that insufferable Luftwaffe arrogance like a shield. An American intelligence officer is trying to question him about German fighter tactics, squadron positions, and the usual intelligence gathering. But this Luftwaffe pilot, this veteran of the Eastern Front and the defense of the Reich, can barely contain his contempt for the Americans surrounding him. Finally, when asked about the quality of American pilots he's faced, he lets loose with a statement dripping with condescension. American pilots? They are not warriors, they are rich boys playing at war, flying expensive machines that your factories mass produce while our men in the East fight a real war. You have numbers and money, but you do not have warriors in the sky. You have spoiled children who would not last 1 week on the Russian front. The room goes deadly quiet. You can hear the wind outside rattling the broken shutters, the distant rumble of trucks on the road, the crackle of a radio in the corner. And then the door opens, and in walks General George S. Patton, Jr., who's been touring nearby units and stopped by to check on the interrogation. He's caught the last part of what the German said, and the look on his face could melt steel. Before we get into what happened next, and trust me, it's absolutely epic, I need to know where all my American patriots are watching from right now. Drop your state, your city, your country in the comments, because this story is about defending the honor of American airmen who died in their thousands over Europe. And I want to know where you're all tuning in from. And listen up. If you love these real, raw, unfiltered World War II stories about American warriors proving themselves against Nazi condescension and arrogance, you need to smash that subscribe button immediately. Hit that like button too, because this is exactly the kind of content that needs to be seen, real history about real American heroes who paid the ultimate price and deserve to be remembered. By the end of this video, you're going to understand not just what Patton said to this arrogant Luftwaffe officer, but why American airmen had already proven him catastrophically wrong, and how American air power became the decisive factor that crushed Nazi Germany. So drop those comments. Tell me if you had family members who served in the Army Air Forces, and let's dive into this incredible story. To understand why this Luftwaffe officer's comment was so outrageously wrong, so offensively ignorant, you need to understand what American pilots had already accomplished by September 1944, and what they'd sacrificed to do it. The U.S. Army Air Forces and Naval Aviation had been fighting in Europe since 1942, and the butcher's bill was already staggering. Over 30,000 American airmen would die in the European theater before the war ended. 30,000 young men, average age maybe 23 or 24, blown out of the sky or burned alive in their aircraft, or frozen to death at 25,000 feet over Germany. These weren't rich boys playing at war. These were warriors fighting the most dangerous kind of combat imaginable. The kind where you couldn't dig a foxhole or hide behind cover, where you were sitting in an aluminum tube filled with high-octane fuel and ammunition, flying into walls of German flak that could shred a bomber in seconds, or facing Luftwaffe fighters flown by veterans with hundreds of kills. The casualty rates for American bomber crews were absolutely horrific in some periods of the strategic bombing campaign. A crew's statistical chance of surviving a full tour of 25 missions was less than 25%. That means 3 out of 4 crews didn't make it. You'd watch your buddies take off on a mission and never come back. See a B-17 explode in midair from a direct flak hit. Watch a burning bomber fall out of formation with men jumping without parachutes, because they'd rather die fast from the fall than burn alive. The smell of aviation fuel and oil. The bone-deep cold at altitude despite heated flight suits. The taste of oxygen from the mask. The deafening roar of 4 radial engines running for hours. The gut-wrenching terror every time you heard the call fighters at 6 o'clock. This was the reality of American bomber operations over Europe. Rich boys playing war? These kids were facing death odds that would make infantry soldiers shake their heads in disbelief. And the fighter pilots, the ones this Luftwaffe captain had the audacity to dismiss as spoiled children? They were flying combat missions that required skills, courage, and aggression that matched any Luftwaffe ace. Sure, American pilots generally had fewer flight hours than their German counterparts in the early years the Luftwaffe had been at war since 1939. Their pilots were veterans with combat experience American rookies couldn't match initially. But American pilots had advantages too. Better training programs that didn't just teach you to fly but taught you to think and adapt. Aircraft that were increasingly superior to what the Germans could field. And most importantly, they kept coming. The Germans had brilliant aces with 200, 300 kills, exceptional individuals who were warriors by any definition. But American air power wasn't built on creating a few super aces. It was built on creating hundreds of competent, aggressive pilots who worked as teams and overwhelmed the enemy through coordinated tactics and sheer numbers. By mid-1944, American fighters P-51 Mustangs, P-47 Thunderbolts, P-38 Lightnings were ranging deep over Germany, escorting bomber formations all the way to Berlin and back, engaging and defeating Luftwaffe fighters, and conducting ground attack missions that destroyed German trains, trucks, tanks, and airfields. The P-51 Mustang in particular was an absolute game-changer, an aircraft that could outfight the best German fighters, while having the range to escort bombers deep into the Reich. Young American pilots were climbing into these machines and going up against veteran Luftwaffe pilots in Me-109s and FW-190s, and coming out victorious more often than not. The kill ratios by 1944 were decisively in favor of American pilots. They were shooting down German aircraft at rates of 3 or 4 to 1. Rich boys playing at war don't achieve those kinds of results. The strategic bombing campaign that American airmen were executing by September 1944 was systematically destroying Germany's ability to wage war, and it was costing American lives at a horrific rate. The 8th Air Force, based in England and conducting daylight precision bombing of German industrial targets, was taking casualties that would have broken lesser organizations. In a single mission, the raid on Schweinfurt on October 14, 1943, the 8th Air Force lost 60 bombers and 600 men, either killed or captured, in one day. One mission. That's like losing an entire infantry battalion in a single battle. And they kept flying. The next day, the next week, the next month. Young cruise pilots, navigators, bombardiers, gunners kept climbing into those bombers, knowing the statistical likelihood was that they wouldn't complete their tour. The roar of hundreds of Wright Cyclone engines, starting up in the pre-dawn darkness at English air bases, the smell of exhaust and hydraulic fluid, the taste of coffee and nerves, the sight of the sun rising as the formations assembled over England before heading toward Germany. These were the sensory memories that survivors would carry for the rest of their lives, along with the memories of friends who didn't come back, the empty bunks in the barracks, the personal effects being packed up, the crew positions that had to be filled with replacements who were strangers. This wasn't playing at war. This was war in its most brutal, unforgiving form. And American airmen kept doing it, mission after mission, because they believed in their cause, and they were determined to break Nazi Germany's war machine, no matter what it cost. By the time that Luftwaffe captain was shot down in September 1944, American air power had already achieved air superiority over all of Western Europe. The Normandy invasion succeeded in large part because Allied, primarily American air forces had so thoroughly suppressed the Luftwaffe that German fighters barely appeared over the beaches on D-Day. The transportation network in France had been so thoroughly destroyed by American and British bombers that German reinforcements couldn't reach the front in strength. American fighter bombers were prowling French skies, destroying anything that moved, making daytime movement suicidal for German forces. The famous photograph of the Falaise Pocket, the killing ground where retreating German forces were trapped and destroyed in August 1944, shows a landscape absolutely carpeted with destroyed vehicles, thousands of them, turned to scrap by relentless Allied air attack. American pilots in P-47s and P-51s would dive down to treetop level, rockets and machine guns blazing, hitting German columns again and again until nothing was moving. It was dangerous work. Ground fire could kill you just as dead as air-to-air combat, but American pilots did it with skill and aggression that gave the Germans absolutely no respite. This Luftwaffe officer, dismissing American pilots as rich boys, had been shot down by the very Air Force he was insulting, was standing in a headquarters that existed only because American air power had made the liberation of France possible, was breathing free air only because an American pilot had chosen not to keep firing and had let him bail out. The arrogance required to stand in that situation and insult American airmen is almost incomprehensible. Patton didn't say anything at first. He just walked slowly into the room, those famous ivory-handled pistols prominent on his hips, his boots clicking on the chateau's marble floor with the kind of deliberate rhythm that made everyone freeze and pay attention. The intelligence officer stepped back instinctively, making space, recognizing that their general had something to say, and they were about to witness it. You could smell the leather of Patton's jacket mixing with the dust and smoke in the air, could hear the creak of his Sam Browne belt as he moved, could feel the temperature in the room shift as all that aggressive energy he carried with him entered the space. Patton stopped about 6 feet from the Luftwaffe captain, close enough to be threatening, but not so close it looked undisciplined. And he studied the German pilot for a long moment with those ice-blue eyes that had stared down everything from Mexican revolutionaries to Nazi tank commanders. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, almost conversational, but with an edge that could cut glass. "Rich boys playing war," he repeated, as if tasting the words, considering them. "That's what you think of American pilots." The German officer, perhaps sensing he'd made a mistake but too proud or too stupid to back down, nodded stiffly. "It is simply tactical analysis, General. Your pilots have advantages in equipment and numbers, but they lack the combat experience and warrior spirit of Luftwaffe pilots who have fought on all fronts." Patton's jaw clenched, and for a second it looked like he might actually hit the man. But instead, he smiled that thin, cold smile that men who'd served under him knew meant someone was about to get verbally destroyed. "Combat experience," Patton said softly. "Warrior spirit. Let me tell you about American pilots and their warrior spirit, Captain. Let me educate you on exactly how wrong you are." Patton started pacing now, his voice rising, taking on that lecturing tone he used when he was making a point he wanted to drive home like a railroad spike. "You mentioned the Russian front, like that's the only place real combat happens. You think your pilots, fighting Ivan in the east, are the only warriors in the sky? Let me tell you what American pilots have been doing while you were playing hero on the Eastern Front. They've been flying unescorted daylight bombing missions deep into Germany, into the teeth of the most concentrated anti-aircraft defenses ever assembled, facing flak so thick you could supposedly walk on it. And they kept flying. They watched their friends die in numbers that would make your Luftwaffe aces weep. And they kept climbing back into those bombers. You know the raid on Ploesti, Captain?" Patton leaned forward, his face inches from the Germans. American bombers attacked the Romanian oil fields at low level, flew through hell itself, lost dozens of aircraft and hundreds of men, and crippled your fuel supply. Rich boys don't do that. Warriors do that. The Luftwaffe captain's face had gone carefully blank, the superior smirk fading as Patton's words hit home. "Or how about this?" Patton continued, his voice getting louder. "Your precious Luftwaffe. Where the hell is it, Captain? I'll tell you where it is. It's been systematically destroyed by those American rich boys you're so dismissive of. Your aces with their hundreds of kills? They're dead, most of them. Shot down by American pilots who maybe had 50 hours of combat time, but who flew better aircraft, used better tactics, and had the guts to take the fight to you instead of hiding behind clouds waiting to bounce stragglers." Patton was on a roll now, and everyone in that room knew better than to interrupt him when he got momentum. "You talk about warrior spirit like it's some mystical quality that only Germans possess. That's the same kind of master race bullshit that got your country into this mess in the first place. Let me tell you what real warrior spirit looks like, Captain. It looks like a 22-year-old farm kid from Iowa, climbing into a B-17 for the 30th time, knowing that statistically he should already be dead, knowing his chances of surviving today's mission are maybe 50-50 at best, and doing it anyway because there's a job to be done. It looks like a fighter pilot from Texas who's already scared the living hell out of himself 3 times this week, going back up to escort those bombers, because that's what his buddies on the ground need him to do. It looks like a crew chief working 18-hour days in freezing English weather to keep those expensive machines flying, because he knows every aircraft that doesn't fly is a mission that doesn't get completed." Patton's voice had that quality now that made it impossible not to listen. That combination of absolute conviction and barely controlled fury. "You think American pilots are soft because they come from a rich country? You think having good equipment and proper training somehow makes them less than warriors? That's the stupidest goddamn thing I've heard all week, and I've heard a lot of stupid things. Having good equipment doesn't make you soft, it makes you smart. Training your pilots properly doesn't make them weak, it makes them professional. And coming from a country rich enough to build thousands of aircraft doesn't diminish their courage, it just means they're dying in a cause that has the resources to eventually win." The intelligence officers were frantically scribbling notes, trying to capture what Patton was saying, knowing this was the kind of thing that would get repeated in barracks and mess halls across the theater. One young lieutenant was grinning openly, pride swelling in his chest at hearing his commanding general defend American airmen with such passion and precision. The Luftwaffe captain was standing rigidly at attention now, his face flushed. Whether from anger or shame was hard to tell. But Patton wasn't done. He never was done until he'd made his point so thoroughly that it couldn't be argued with. "You mention the Russian front like that's the measure of all combat. You know what American pilots are doing while your buddies are fighting Ivan? They're flying over Germany in broad daylight, something your Luftwaffe stopped being able to do over England back in 1940. They're hitting your factories, your rail yards, your oil refineries, your ball-bearing plants. They're systematically destroying your ability to wage war, and you can't stop them. Your vaunted Luftwaffe throws everything it has at our bomber streams, and our fighters cut through them like a knife through butter. Your jet fighters, yeah, we know about those. Your Me-262s that were supposed to be game changers, where are they? Why aren't they stopping our bombers? I'll tell you why. Because your production is so disrupted by our bombing that you can't build enough of them. And you don't have fuel to fly the ones you do build. And the pilots who might have flown them are dead, shot down by American rich boys in P-51s. The room was absolutely silent except for Patton's voice, which had dropped back to that quiet, deadly tone that was somehow more intimidating than shouting. And those P-51s you sneer at? Those expensive machines that you dismiss? They're escorting bombers all the way to Berlin and back, something your experts said was impossible. They're outflying, outfighting, and outlasting everything you can put in the air. Is that because American pilots are better warriors than Germans? Maybe. Or maybe it's because we're smart enough to build the best equipment we can and train our people properly, instead of relying on some mystical warrior spirit bullshit. Patton stepped back, crossing his arms, and delivered his final verdict. You're a prisoner of war, Captain. You're here because an American pilot shot you out of the sky and chose to let you live. You're standing in France, which is free again because American military power, including American air power, drove you bastards out. And you have the audacity to call American pilots rich boys playing at war? He shook his head slowly, disgust evident on his face. You're not just wrong, Captain. You're delusional. You're standing in the wreckage of your own failed conquest, surrounded by evidence of American military superiority, and you still can't admit that we beat you fair and square, because we're better than you. Not racially, not morally necessarily, but militarily. Our pilots, our soldiers, our equipment, our tactics, all of it is better than yours. And the proof is that we're winning and you're losing. That's not playing at war, Captain. That's war. And we're damn good at it. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of distant artillery, a reminder that the war was still ongoing, that American forces were still pushing east, still defeating German resistance at every turn. The Luftwaffe captain had nothing to say. What could he say? Every point Patton had made was backed by the undeniable reality of American success and German defeat. The intelligence officers looked like they wanted to applaud, but knew better than to break the moment. But Patton wasn't quite finished. He had one more point to drive home. One more lesson to teach this arrogant German, who represented everything the Nazis had gotten wrong about the American fighting spirit. He walked over to the wall where maps showed the current positions of Allied and German forces, the steady eastward progression of the front lines marked in different colors. You want to know the real difference between American pilots and German pilots, Captain? I'll tell you. American pilots are fighting for something. They volunteered, most of them. Anyway, left comfortable homes and promising futures to come over here and fight. They're not fighting because some dictator ordered them to. Not fighting to conquer and enslave. Not fighting for Lebensraum or racial purity or any of that Nazi garbage. They're fighting because they genuinely believe, that stopping your regime matters, that freedom is worth dying for, that going home and telling their kids they helped defeat fascism is more important than staying safe. Patton's voice softened slightly, but the intensity never wavered. German pilots might be brave, might be skilled, might even be warriors by some definition, but they're fighting for a lost cause, for a regime that's already defeated, even if you don't know it yet. American pilots are fighting for victory, and that makes all the difference in the world. He turned back to the Luftwaffe officer. You'll sit out the rest of this war in a POW camp, Captain. And while you're there, I want you to think about something. Think about those rich boys playing war, who are going to finish destroying the Luftwaffe, who are going to bomb Germany into submission, who are going to escort the bombers that will reduce your cities to rubble. And when this war ends with Germany's unconditional surrender, when you finally go home to whatever's left of your country, remember this conversation. Remember that you dismissed American warriors as spoiled children. And remember how wrong you were. With that, Patton nodded to the intelligence officers, signaling they should continue the interrogation, and walked out of the room with the same deliberate stride he'd entered with, leaving behind a silence that felt heavy with the weight of truth. The story of that confrontation spread through American units with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. Within days, pilots at air bases across England and France had heard some version of what Patton had said to the captured Luftwaffe officer, and the effect on morale was electric. American air crews were already proud of what they were accomplishing, already knew in their hearts that they were making a difference despite the horrific casualties. But hearing that Patton, a general they respected, a warrior who understood what they were going through, had defended them so passionately against German contempt, gave them a validation they didn't even know they needed. One bomber pilot stationed at an 8th Air Force base in England wrote in a letter home, "We heard that General Patton tore into some kraut pilot who called us rich boys playing at war. I wish I could have been there to hear it. Every time we lose a crew, every time we come back with the aircraft shot to hell and buddies bleeding or dead, we wonder if people really understand what we're doing up here." Knowing that Patton gets it, that he values what we're doing that means something. That sentiment was echoed across the American Air Forces in Europe. These young men, facing death odds that would terrify most people, took strength from knowing that their sacrifice was recognized and valued by commanders they respected. And the facts, the cold, hard statistics, backed up everything Patton had said. By September 1944, the United States Army Air Forces and Naval Aviation had achieved a level of dominance over the Luftwaffe that was historically unprecedented. The numbers tell a story of systematic destruction. In the first 6 months of 1944, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 500 aircraft in combat over Western Europe, primarily to American fighters. During Big Week in February 1944, a coordinated series of raids on German aircraft production facilities, American bombers and fighters destroyed hundreds of German aircraft both in the air and on the ground, dealt a devastating blow to German fighter production, and killed or wounded experienced Luftwaffe pilots at a rate the Germans couldn't replace. The quality of German pilots was declining rapidly because their best pilots were dead shot down by those American rich boys, and the training program couldn't keep up. New German pilots were going into combat with maybe 60 hours of flight time, compared to the 300-plus hours American pilots received. The result was slaughter. By the summer of 1944, American fighter pilots were achieving kill ratios that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. The 357th Fighter Group, flying P-51 Mustangs, achieved a kill ratio of better than 5-to-1. The 56th Fighter Group, flying P-47 Thunderbolts, shot down over 650 German aircraft while losing about 130 of their own. These weren't rich boys playing at war. These were elite warriors executing a systematic campaign of aerial superiority with professionalism and lethality that the Luftwaffe couldn't match. The strategic bombing campaign that American airmen were prosecuting was also achieving results that vindicated every sacrifice. By September 1944, German oil production had been reduced by over 90% from its peak, strangling the Wehrmacht's ability to move its armored forces effectively. The transportation network was so thoroughly destroyed that moving supplies from German factories to the front lines took weeks instead of days. Ball bearing production, essential for everything from aircraft engines to tank transmissions, had been severely disrupted. The German economy was being systematically dismantled from 20,000 feet by American bomber crews who faced death every time they flew, but kept flying anyway. The human cost was staggering. In addition to the 30,000 who would die in combat, tens of thousands more American airmen were wounded, shot down, and captured, or psychologically broken by the stress of repeated combat missions. The 8th Air Force alone would suffer over 47,000 casualties by war's end, but they were winning. Every mission brought the end of the war closer. Every bomb that hit its target degraded German war-making capacity. Every German fighter shot down was one less aircraft to threaten Allied ground forces or bombing missions. The courage required to keep climbing into those aircraft, mission after mission, knowing the odds and doing it anyway, that warrior spirit in its purest form, and no amount of German arrogance could diminish it. There's also the deeply personal dimension of American air combat that the Luftwaffe officers' dismissive comment completely failed to understand. These weren't faceless machines flown by interchangeable operators. These were individuals, farm boys and city kids, mechanics and students, athletes and artists who'd volunteered for the most dangerous duty in the military because they wanted to make a difference. They formed bonds with their crews that were as strong as any family ties. A bomber crew pilot, co-pilot, navigator, bombardier, engineer, radio operator, and gunners lived together, flew together, and often died together. You knew your crewmates' dreams and fears, knew who had a girl back home, and who was saving money to buy a farm after the war, knew who was scared but wouldn't admit it, and who cracked jokes to keep everyone's spirits up. When you lost a crew, you didn't lose 11 strangers, you lost 11 friends, 11 futures, 11 families that would receive a telegram they'd been dreading. Fighter pilots formed similar bonds with their wingmen and squadron mates, trusting each other with their lives every time they flew. The smell of coffee and cigarettes in the ready room before a mission, the sound of nervous laughter and forced confidence, the taste of fear in your mouth that you swallowed down and didn't talk about, the feel of the control stick in your hand as you climbed toward altitude, knowing that in a few hours you might be dead. These were the realities of American air combat, and they forged warriors every bit as tough as any Luftwaffe ace, whatever this German captain believed. The ultimate irony of that Luftwaffe captain's dismissive comment about American pilots being rich boys playing war is that by the time he made it, the outcome of the air war over Europe had already been decisively settled in America's favor. The Luftwaffe, once the most feared air force in the world, the service that had terrorized Europe during the Blitzkrieg campaigns and the Battle of Britain, was now a broken shell barely capable of defending German airspace. The massive fighter formations that had once darkened European skies were gone, reduced to scattered remnants hiding from American fighter sweeps. German pilots were hoarding fuel, choosing their engagements carefully, avoiding combat when possible, because they simply couldn't replace their losses. Meanwhile, American aircraft filled the skies over Europe with an abundance that must have seemed almost incomprehensible to German forces used to operating on razor-thin margins. Formations of hundreds of bombers, each one escorted by multiple fighter groups, crossing German territory in broad daylight, with an arrogance that came from total air superiority. This was the reality of the air war by late 1944. And those American rich boys had achieved it through courage, sacrifice, and professional competence that exceeded anything the Luftwaffe could counter. The numbers don't lie. By the end of 1944, the 8th Air Force alone was flying missions with over 2,000 heavy bombers supported by 1,000 fighters. The Luftwaffe could sometimes muster a few hundred fighters to oppose them, and those German pilots, no matter how brave or skilled, were simply overwhelmed. American losses were still significant. You can't send thousands of aircraft into combat without casualties, but they were sustainable and decreasing as American tactical and technological advantages increased. German losses, conversely, were catastrophic and unsustainable. A death spiral that would end with the Luftwaffe's complete destruction. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, the statistics of the air war told a story of complete American dominance. The U.S. Army Air Forces in Europe had flown over 1.5 million sorties, dropped over 2.7 million tons of bombs on Axis targets, and destroyed approximately 18,000 German aircraft in aerial combat, while losing about 8,000 of their own to all-causes fighters, flak, accidents, and operational losses. That's better than a 2-to-1 kill ratio, despite the fact that American bombers, not fighters, bore the brunt of German attacks and couldn't maneuver like fighters to avoid being hit. American fighter pilots, specifically, achieved kill ratios that were even more lopsided. The top American aces had dozens of kills each. And more importantly, Average American fighter pilots were consistently defeating average German pilots in the last year of the war. The cream of the Luftwaffe, the 200-kill aces, the veterans of Poland and France and Russia, were mostly dead by 1945, and their replacements were kids with minimal training being thrown into an impossible situation. American pilots, meanwhile, were better trained than ever, flying superior aircraft, and backed by a tactical and logistical system that the Germans couldn't hope to match. The Luftwaffe captain's dismissal of American pilots as rich boys playing war wasn't just wrong, it was a catastrophic misreading of military reality that typified the kind of delusional thinking that had led Germany to defeat. The Nazis had convinced themselves of their own superiority so thoroughly that they couldn't recognize when they were being beaten by warriors who were simply better at the job. The personal stories of American airmen who flew in the European theater give the statistics human dimension and emotional weight. Consider Lieutenant Charlie Brown, a B-17 pilot whose bomber was shot to pieces over Germany in December 1943, so badly damaged that it was barely flying, his crew wounded and dying, himself dazed from wounds and hypoxia. A German fighter pilot, Franz Stigler, pulled alongside and could have finished them off easily, but instead recognized the helpless bomber as a fellow warrior in distress and escorted them toward the English Channel, gesturing for them to land in Sweden, where they'd be interned safely. Brown made it back to England against all odds, and 40 years later tracked down Stigler, and they became friends. Two old warriors who'd recognized something in each other across the divide of war. Or consider the story of the Memphis Belle, the B-17 that completed 25 missions, when the statistical likelihood was that it wouldn't survive even half that many, became a symbol of American resilience and courage. Her crew lionized back home, but always conscious of how many other crews hadn't made it. Or the Tuskegee Airmen, African-American pilots who fought two wars, one against Nazi Germany and one against American racism, and still achieved a combat record that was exemplary, never losing a bomber under their escort to enemy fighters, proving beyond any doubt that courage and skill had nothing to do with the color of your skin. These stories, and thousands more like them, represent the reality of American air combat and World War II warriors who faced impossible odds, suffered terrible casualties, and kept fighting until victory was won. Rich boys don't do that. Spoiled children don't do that. Warriors do that. Patton understood this instinctively, which is why his defense of American pilots was so passionate and so effective. He recognized warrior spirit when he saw it, whether it came from tankers or infantry or airmen, whether it wore an American uniform or a German one. He had nothing but contempt for the Nazi ideology and the regime it produced. But he could respect individual German soldiers and pilots as worthy opponents. What he couldn't respect, what triggered his fury, was the kind of delusional arrogance that refused to acknowledge reality, that clung to mythical notions of superiority, even in the face of overwhelming evidence to the contrary. That Luftwaffe captain embodied everything Patton hated about the Nazi mindset: the reflexive dismissal of enemies as inferior, the inability to learn from defeat, the substitution of ideology for honest tactical assessment. When Patton tore into him, he wasn't just defending American pilots, he was attacking the core delusion that had led Germany into a war it couldn't win against enemies it had fatally underestimated. And by doing so in front of American officers who would spread the story, Patton reinforced the lesson that American warriors at all levels needed to internalize. We're as good as anyone. Our way of fighting works, and anyone who dismisses us as inferior is making a fatal mistake. So here's what you need to take away from this story. American airmen in World War II were some of the greatest warriors this nation has ever produced. They faced death odds that would break most people, watched their friends die in numbers that are hard to comprehend, and kept flying mission after mission because the cause was worth the sacrifice. They weren't rich boys playing at war, they were warriors who happened to come from a rich country that was smart enough to give them the best equipment and training possible. And they used those advantages to systematically destroy the Luftwaffe and bring Nazi Germany to its knees. Over 30,000 of them never came home. They're buried in American cemeteries across Europe, or lost in the ocean, or scattered across the German countryside where their aircraft fell. And they deserve to be remembered, not as spoiled children, but as the heroes they were, young men who volunteered to fly into hell because their country needed them, and who kept flying until the job was done. Now I need you to do something for me. If this story moved you, if it gave you a new appreciation for what American airmen sacrificed in World War II, hit that like button right now. Subscribe to this channel if you want more stories about American warriors who prove their worth against impossible odds. Drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and whether you had family members who served in the Army Air Forces or Navy Aviation in World War II. I want to hear their stories, because every one of them matters. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that American military excellence was built on the sacrifices of warriors who faced death and kept fighting. And the next time someone tries to dismiss American fighting men as somehow inferior or less warrior-like than their adversaries, remember what Patton said to that Luftwaffe captain. Remember the 30,000 airmen who died over Europe. And remember that we earned our reputation through blood and courage and sacrifice. They weren't playing at war. They were winning it. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.